What up, though? I'm Red Death, and welcome to Hip Hop History. I'm gonna go by facts that I know, experiences growing up with hip hop, um, stuff I believe in. I used to watch a lot of DVDs or videos or read magazines, and I learned about hip hop at a really young age. It started a little bit before my time. Hip hop started in 1973 in Bronx, New York. I got New York in the background. And look at me. So it started with Kool Herc. Supposedly, there's speculations that DJ Hollywood was also one of the original MCs like Kool Herc. Well, originally they were DJs back in them days. Before the MCing part started, DJs were playing in clubs, underground scenes in New York back then. And what they would do is they'd be like a hype man. They would get on a mic when they're mixing music, spinning records, as we call it. They would, get on the mic and say things. And what they do is they would rhyme. They were like hype man that rhyme. So that's how it started. Well, it started supposedly in August of 73 with Kool Herc's party. But the start of the MCs, they can say him or DJ Hollywood, I've heard. Comment below who you think is really originator. Is it Kool Herc? Is it DJ Hollywood? Was it then? I'm gonna give a lot of mentions to hip hop artists. I'm not gonna be able to cover them all. I'm gonna miss a lot of stuff, but I'm gonna go by who were basically the biggest influences in the beginning, like I'm talking about right now. So hip hop started back then in the 70s. As it progressed in the 70s, and 1979, which is the year I'm born, I hate to admit it, but it was born on the radio with Curtis Blow. I believe the first hip hop song that was ever on the radio was his Christmas song. I forget the song title. I think "Wrap It Up Christmas" or "Rapping Christmas," whatever. Check it out. Google it. And you also had, at that time, you had Sugar Hill Gang. I think they're the first recording artists to go like gold or something like that. Maybe platinum. I don't know. I don't know if they went platinum back in them days. But pretty much that was the beginning on the radio. So like a lot of us, like me, growing up in southeastern Michigan near Detroit, we didn't know about it till the rest of the world knew about it in 79 when it was on the radio. So you got to figure back in them days and the 70s and the 80s, like early 80s, technology was very slow. So a lot of that stuff, a lot of music and pop culture and everything from the 70s to the 80s kind of blended in the beginning of the 80s. Like the 70s crossed over to the 80s. Some stuff faded out, not much. I just say bell bombs and like disco, pretty much. I feel like hip hop kind of took place of disco in a way. You know what I'm saying? Disco died and hip hop kind of just took over and nonstop to this day. But so you had like African Bubata. He was part of that beginning of the scene too. And he was kind of like that verge of the 80s, hip hop. So you got to figure most of hip hop was in the 80s for all of us. You know what I mean? Because after 79 came the 80s, Then you had groups like, then you had like Run DMC. But before Run DMC, you had a lot of like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five in the early 80s, which was, they were like, there was a lot of hip hop groups like them. You know what I mean? It was a bunch of dudes rapping a mic, telling stories, kind of beginning of storytelling. I mean, I guess that's what hip hop really was, storytelling in the beginning. After the DJ, started in the 70s, it became people started telling stories and rhyming, and there was all these different groups and everybody had like the number of people that were in a group was part of their a group title and stuff like that. Then you get to the Run DMC era with LL Cool J, when Def Jams became so big, because hip hop was already on the radio. LL Cool J was kicking it hard. He was pretty hardcore for back in them days, and so was Run DMC. You know what I mean? They were like the hardcore hip hoppers. A little bit harder than the earlier 80s and 70s stuff, you know what I mean? They weren't gangster rap, they were just a little bit harder, you know what I mean? Run DMC was the first group to like fuse rock with hip hop, you know what I mean, with Aerosmith. And, most of hip hop, is originated from like blues and jazz cuts and samples and whatnot. So like that was a basis of hip hop was cuts and stuff from different records. DJs were mixing two vinyls together. I got a vinyl right here, Eazy-E. They're mixing two records together, and Grandmaster Flash is one that he was an innovator. He started a lot of way how you mix the records together. He was doing stuff nobody else was doing, so he was kind of like the beginning of hip hop's like how everybody started doing. Everybody started copying him, you know what I mean? And like, so they were using old jazz records and old blues records. A lot of people, they think like they always say like, oh, hip hop came out, back the 30s, 40s, something like that, where like with jazz cats, because they would scat and rhyme with their music. But that really wasn't hip hop. That was just, they were just rhyming, I mean, you think of that, I guess you would have to say nursery rhymes part of hip hop too then. Because that's, that's where all the rhyming began, So that's not really hip hop though. Hip hop didn't become hip hop till 73, you know what I mean, with the DJ. DJs are the reason why hip hop started, Then it became MCing through the DJs, We're not talking about radio DJs, We're talking DJs, they spin records and clubs and parties and stuff like that. And so getting back to the 80s, so Run DMC, I feel like Run DMC, part of LL Cool J, they kind of made hip hop a little bit more poppy at that time, like with their music videos, and they were getting a larger audience, you know what I mean, in like the mid 80s. Like, hip hop was kind of really blowing up at that point, you know what I mean? It was becoming really mainstream, from the 70s being underground to on the radio in the 80s and in clubs and everywhere, like around the world and all over the United States. Like, hip hop started blowing up in the mid 80s, and, it started changing. It started taking form. There is becoming different forms of hip hop, and you think about like that to like going towards like say 87 NWA came out, and NWA kind of like started this genre of gangster rap. They weren't the beginning of gangster rap. They kind of like started the genre, kind of made gangster rap a thing. If you're going to say who's the beginning of gangster rap, you would go Schoolie D, and he was out in New York. Well, he was talking about hustling and, street thug mentality stuff that no other rapper was talking about. I mean, rappers were talking about streets, you know what I mean? Like LL Cool J and Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5. They were talking about the streets, but not as a hustler level. They weren't talking about like gangsters type stuff, So Schoolie D was basically the beginning of that, like, but nobody called it gangster rap. It was just street hip hop, you know what I mean? Then you had Ice-T out in the West, he kind of didn't really start off as a gangster rapper per se, but he slowly started doing that kind of stuff like Schoolie D, Then I feel like, well, then you had Too Short with the pimpin' rhymes. And not Cool Mo D, I'm sorry. Big Daddy Kane had that pimpin' flavor too. But like that really wasn't gangster rap. I mean, Too Short became sort of a gangster rap. He did become a gangster rapper. But like when he started off, he was that pimping stuff, which that was kind of gangster rap. So and then like Ice T and Too Short, then you got NWA, and NWA came raw. They were talking about gang banging and doing gangsta stuff. Like that was when hip hop like became that new form. You know what I mean? I mean, you had a little bit of forms here and there. You had the break beats, and you had the electro funk, and you had like you had like the poppy in the underground hip hop, which was before the gangsta era, before the late 80s, before 87. So like NWA came out with Straight Outta Compton. I got the cover right here. Came out with Straight Outta Compton, and that album just blew up. You know what I mean? And that was the beginning of gangster rap. So 80s ended, right? NWA came out with their last album in 1990, 91. I think 91. They came out with their last album, and they were keeping gangsta like rap around. Like nobody was really doing it yet. It was just like NWA. I mean, Too Short and everybody and Ice T were kind of following the lines too, but it was like into the early 90s. It was still like hip hop. It was straight up hip hop. Like you had like Tribe Called Quest and Pharcyde, and like these were hip hop artists, not gangster rappers. They were just rapping about the streets, but at a different level. You know what I mean? So NWA ended up splitting in that, I think in 91 that year. I don't know, you can watch the movie Straight Outta Compton. A lot of it's not what really happened, but a lot of it is at the same time. But it's just a good movie, period. So like back to the early 90s, but you had Ice Cube, who left NWA. He was keeping it gangsta, but he wasn't like on a poppy form. Like he wasn't a big radio rapper and when he was started off his solo career. I mean, he ended up having radio hits, but like gangster rap really got big is when Dre did his solo stuff with, then he brought Snoop Dogg on the scene. So when they came out, when the Chronic came out, what was it, 92, that's when that's when gangster rap took over. Right after that, gangster rap took over. You had tons of different gangster rap. You had MC8, you had E40, you had Spice One, a lot of, West Side cats, So like hip hop, gangster rap took over hip hop. I mean, hip hop was still around, but after Dre, everybody was doing gangster rap. You know what I mean? Everybody, like, hip hop wasn't soft anymore. I mean, you still had hip hop artists around, but you had the gangster rap artists that were, they were ruling the radio. I mean, I really don't know how they did it. With, they had to edit a lot of their music and stuff. I remember all the videos were edited. Everything was just chopped up, but they didn't chop it up, for it to be not radio quality. Like it was good enough to be on the radio. So like gangster rap took over the radio. You know what I mean? And like it got to the point like even hip hop started. It took like a fallback, like regular hip hop. Like it became sort of too poppy. Like Will Smith, he went from Fresh Prince with DJ Jazzy Jeff in like the 80s. He was doing his hip hop thing. But like into the 90s, he started becoming way too poppy. And that's kind of how hip hop started becoming. So everybody didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear the hard stuff. We want to hear the more street vibes than a good radio song. You know what I mean? Some gangster rap kept that flavor around. So you go into like, start in the late 90s, you got when No Limit came out. So they started doing that Soulja Street thing. And like soon enough, Cash Money came out. So like this army soldier vibe started taking over in the late 90s. Not completely, you had DMX came out, you know what I mean? Jay-Z was still making hits. So you still had them vibes and stuff, like the hip hop, hardcore hip hop vibes. But you had these soldier music coming out in the late 90s. Everybody had the same album cover with the diamonds as their letters and whatnot. Um, to me, after the 90s, into the early 2000s, hip hop was, all of it was becoming way too mainstream. It just became commercial. People were worried about more making money than they were making the music. It just was becoming too much of a commercial. People were making way too much money. It was starting to take away that street vibe. Everybody was just making songs for the radio. So, you had like Nelly and Ludacris and that genre in the early 2000s. They kind of took over or became that poppy culture rap music. Ludacris was, he had that crunk Southern style. Nelly had some of it too, you know what I mean? He had a little bit of gangster vibe, but like, it was becoming so mainstream, that's the way it was going. So I'd say about between 2002 and 2005, hip hop kind of died. Like, it died off. Like, I remember Nas came out with an album, Hip Hop is Dead, and that could have been the truest album to that date because hip hop was fading off. Like, it was becoming so mainstream that, it wasn't like street anymore. It was just like radio, studio music, you know what I mean? Some of the youngsters, you're going to disagree. People say Lil Wayne's the best rapper ever. Dude, if it wasn't for Juvenile, like, Cash Money wouldn't have been on the map. Juvenile put Cash Money on the map with his hits, you know what I mean? He if you've seen the Cash Money versus No Limit, you can see Juvenile was the heavy hitter on there, you know what I mean? But I don't want to get into all that. We're talking about hip hop here, and I'm going to take it back in my era of hip hop. Well, not my era, but growing up in Detroit, southeastern Michigan. Our hip hop scene didn't start till '89, so 10 years after it started on the radio. You had Esham and Awesome Dre. I've talked about Esham. I have a whole stream about him and who he is. But he's kind of like one of the original rappers from Detroit to really put his name out there. You know what I mean? Him and Awesome Dre. Maybe if you lived in the city and your boy down the street was a dope MC, but he never did shows, maybe he did a little hole-in-the-wall shows, and he never had a real album. Maybe he made an album out of his basement. It was basement quality that nobody really knew about. He might have been fresh as hell, but who knows? You know what I mean? But like, he wasn't known like outside of the city. Awesome Dre, Esham were known outside of Detroit, in all parts of Michigan. Eventually out of Michigan, whatever. Blah blah blah. So Esham kept going. He kept making album after album after album. You know what I mean? And Awesome Dre, I think he had one album, and I think it was on Prior Records, big record company. But that was it. That's all he did. I tried to Google who came out first. Was it Dre or Awesome Dre or Esham? And it didn't really give me whose album came out first. It was just the same year. Maybe I should Google it again because I Googled this a while back, and I couldn't figure out what it was. You know what I mean? Who came out first type deal. But like I said, Esham kept going. Now Esham had his own style, which was called acid rap, which was rock mixed with rap. Not like like a band with hip hop. You know what I mean? It was more like Esham was using rock samples off off Black Sabbath and whatnot. So he dubbed his stuff, he called his stuff acid rap. Now, since he was sort of blowing up here in Detroit in Michigan, he never went national or whatever, but like, he was such a big influence on Detroit hip hop at that time. So other big names, you had Kid Rock, okay? Kid Rock came on the scene. He was a rapper. He wasn't doing that country rock or whatever you want to call it. Kid Rock was a straight up rapper. Like, he came out and you could tell he studied a little bit of Esham's style. I don't remember I heard or read this, but somewhere said that Esham taught Kid Rock how to rap or whatnot. They knew each other. Which I kind of can see. Back in them days, there's a couple songs had the same like guitar riff or bass line that Kid Rock uses. Esham used the same song or whatever. But you can almost tell Kid Rock was kind of rapping like Esham in a way at that time. So Esham was a big influence. So then we're talking, this is early 90s when Kid Rock jumped on the scene with not soon after it was ICP, Insane Clown Posse. Well, at that time they were Inner City Posse. And you know, they had a little EP that came out with their Inner City Posse. So they were trying to find their feet or whatever. And they knew about Esham's music, right? So like Esham was blowing the spot up and ICP kind of, you know, they followed suit basically. So Esham came out of his second album, which was an EP called Homie Don't Play. I don't know if you remember in the early 90s or late, well, 89 probably, when In Living Color came out. It was a sketch show back then. And they had a character in Homie the Clown. And it was Damon Wayans. And he dressed like a clown. He had like a sock. And like little kids will say the wrong thing to him. So he hit him over the head with a sock and be like, homie, don't play. Homie, don't play that. That's what he would say all the time. So Esham saw that, and that was part of pop culture back in the day. So Esham took that and put it into his EP. He called his album, was it Homie Don't Play? Homie the Clown? Whatever. But so on the cover, Esham's wearing face paint like a clown. He had white gloves, white face paint, you know what I mean? And he kind of ran with that just for that album, you know? And so ICP saw this. And Esham was such a big influence on him. Esham ended up producing a couple tracks off their first LP when they became Insane Clown Posse. So when they became Insane Clown Posse, on the cover of their first album, the one I talked about when they're Inner City Posse, they had a dude dressed in clown paint on the cover. And I guess people thought it was them or one of them, you know. They're like, oh, who's the guy in the face paint? Well, it was the clown. And so like they kind of saw that from Esham. And well, they did see that from Esham, and they started painting their faces like clowns. And they started talking the same kind of, it's called horrorcore, you know, not just acid rap, it was called horrorcore. Where they took like scary images and scary things and just like evil things into their hip hop. So Insane Clown Posse became the Wicked Clowns. And Esham used to say the wicked shit. The wicked shit was the shit he was talking about, the shit he was rapping about. So like ICP, you know, they adopted that, which was cool because they're all boys, you know. So like that was part of the scene. And Detroit was this wicked shit. So Detroit started off with this dark, scary rap. Like it reminded you of like the worst ghetto imaginable, like scary places. Like other black folks wouldn't even go to some of these hoods. They were that scary. And that's kind of what their music was projecting. Had that scary vibe that you know, in the mainstream that wasn't really there. I mean, they say the beginning of horrorcore, you know, the style that Esham and ICP were doing, was a national act, was the Ghetto Boys. That's how they started with that dark horror rap. But that's not what they stuck to. That's just how they came out in the beginning. You know, it wasn't called horrorcore. That's not the direction they went. You know, it wasn't as dark and lethal as the Wicked shit. So like that was kind of like the beginning. You know, for them. You know, it's not like they were jocking that type of style, but that was like the type of style. I guess this is what I read and I heard that Russell Simmons, the owner of Def Jams, heard Esham's music, he has a rap group. Well, he had a rap group, and he heard their music, and Russell Simmons called it horrorcore. You know, horrorcore became a thing. It's still a thing to this day. There's a lot of new school rappers in the underground world that are doing horrorcore, like Suicide Boys. I guess they're more a national level, but they're new school. They do that horrorcore type music. But I don't know where they got that from. Like, I don't know if they hear ICP, Esham and stuff. They might have heard others. Who knows, you know? But they were that horrorcore. So, like, that horrorcore was kind of like a new form of hip hop. And I feel like it started really here in Detroit. Like, you know what I mean? With Esham, that ICP. Kid Rock really didn't do the whole dark hip hop stuff. He was more of the party rock and, you know, stuff like that in hip hop. And so like Esham became big here in the city, that other artists started looking up to him back in them days, back in like the 90s, you know, when he was getting heard all over the place. You know, you had Eminem looked up to Esham. You had Royce the 5'9". You had, you know, maybe even Tech Nine. You had so many artists that were influenced on Esham. And like, you know, I kind of based Detroit hip hop scene off of him because he was the first one that actually was putting his name out there back in the day. And everybody was listening to. Like, everybody in my high school knew who he was. You know, many, many years later, a lot of people don't know who he was because he wasn't part of that genre, that 90s hip hop genre. He's still relevant to this day, but I'm gonna stop talking about him because I got a whole stream about him. But that's basically how Detroit hip hop, you know, started here. You know, before your Eminems. Oh, but on more of a national level, almost forgot. Back in the early 90s, I want to say 1990, 91, maybe even 92. There's a rapper called Boss, the female rapper from Detroit. She might be like a woman Eazy-E. She wore lokes and wore a beanie, and like she just got, you know, she got that West Coast vibe, but she's from Detroit here, and she was signed with a major record deal, and she kind of blew up the spot. She never had no big radio hit, but like she was mainstream. She you know, she had a music video and stuff. And I remember hearing her music back in them days. And my boy had her album. I think she only made one album, honestly. And so she kind of put Detroit on a map on a national level. Because, like, you know, you had your Awesome Dre, but Awesome Dre didn't really, you know, he didn't. That was '89, you know. That was just that year, you know. It probably leaked over for a couple more years after that. But, you know, I think Boss had more of an influence, maybe because of her music video, on the national level of Detroit. But she kind of fit in more with the West Coast hip hop, had more of that, you know, she had the gangster rap vibe. And you want to talk about, you know, besides her, outside Detroit, in Michigan, from Flint, you got MC Breed. Now, MC Breed was probably the biggest MC out of Detroit. I mean, out of Michigan. Out of Michigan, back in the 90s, you know, early 90s, before Eminem, you had MC Breed. MC Breed was huge, man. And he only had one hit, you know what I mean? His albums are great, though. I mean, he's not really a one-hit wonder, I wouldn't consider. He had a lot of fresh flavor. He did do a song with Tupac, which that was sort of a hit. Not a big hit, but that was a national big, you know, song. You know, But like MC Breed was part of that West Coast flavor too. Like he was rapping with Tupac and like Spice One and a lot of the, West Coast rappers. We're considered the Midwest here in Michigan, so I guess that kind of makes sense. But we some of the rappers here in Detroit, they have that New York City hip hop, I guess you say vibe, like not all MCs, but like the way they flow, like your Royce and Five Nines, even Stretch Money, shout out Stretch Money, he's new school, more new school. He raps that New York type style, and but a lot of our beats here in Michigan and a lot of the artists, not all of our beats, but a lot of our beats were like funky, like that West Coast flavor. We had funk in mixers, like Breed and even Esham used some funk stuff, ICP, funk, that funky hip hop from the West Coast was over here in Detroit too. There's a little bit of influence, and you can tell in New York. So our music's kind of like a cross between West Coast hip hop and East Coast hip hop when it comes to our beats and stuff, which makes sense because those are the two biggest sides of hip hop. Um, so Breed, blew up. Then you had a group just under him was the Dayton Family. They weren't as big as Breed. One of the guys from Dayton Family, they're a rap group from Flint. Bootleg was his name. He did No Future Frontin' remix. What was that? Late '90s with Breed. So Breed took that song from the early '90s, No Future in Your Front, brought it back out in the late '90s, remixed it, and it was still a huge hit. I remember it was in the club all the time. Not just because I was here in Michigan, but that was a big hit. You know what I mean? And so they, but soon after that, the late '90s was '98, and Eminem came out. And Eminem blew up. Like that was it. He was probably the largest rapper out of Michigan ever. Bigger than Breed and everybody else. He was huge. He's still big. You know what I mean? I mean, he doesn't fit in with the new hip hop now. Like I said, I think hip hop started fading out to me between 2002 and 2005. I think after me for 2002 for sure. Just that bling bling era just wasn't my thing, man. I just felt like they cared about the money too much, man. They need to get back to the roots of hip hop and the street of hip hop. I mean, they still talk the streets and hard they are, but they never. It wasn't street like it was anymore. Like it got worse and worse to me. I mean, most of my hip hop that I listen to now, I still listen to Esham. He's still relevant, but he's still underground. He's still fresh. Um, I like artists that've been around. Like Ice Cube came on an album last 2 years. Well, 2004, 2005. It's 2006 or 2026. I'm sorry. Uh, Nothing's out yet that I've heard, but they're still relevant. You know what I mean? And to me, they still sound good. Like all the artists I grew up that are still making music is probably only hip hop I listen to now. I don't really find any new artists that I like. Um, I have been listening to this guy I didn't know about. I think he seems like he's been out for a while. Um, MC Bellyman, he's from England. And I played it for my friends the other day. They didn't really care for it. If you know about techno music or electronic music like drum and bass, he be rapping over drum and bass. But he's from England, so he's an English accent, and like he had like an English chick sing with him and stuff. Why he's flowing over dubstep or yeah, no, not really dubstep. Drum and bass, um, which was different to me because drum and bass and like techno and all that, it didn't have lyrics. You know what I mean? It was just beats. And just DJ spinning like mixing records like hip hop. But more techno stuff, all that kind of stuff is more repetitive. You know what I mean? It's not like hip hop. It's not break beats and just bass lines and funk and stuff. Well, it's got funk too, but yeah, they used to be part of the scene together. That's a total another conversation, but that's pretty much my hip hop story. I mean, there might be a lot I forgot or left out, or if there's anything that was wrong on, comment. Don't forget to like, subscribe, notification, hit that notification bell so you can see more of my videos. You know, I probably won't be doing too many hip hop um, videos. I mean, maybe talk about maybe an artist or some DJs, have some people on here. You know, that's what I plan to do anyway. But I won't be able to repeat some of this stuff like the history of hip hop. I mean, I kind of jumped around year to year, but I kind of broke it down to you guys how it all started and changed and whatnot. But well, I'm gonna thank you guys for watching. Peace.